The gym was buzzing with the usual energy, a mix of grunts, the clatter of weights, and the rhythmic sound of treadmills in motion. It was just another ordinary day, or so it seemed, but something was about to unfold that no one could have predicted. In a corner of the gym, amidst the steady hum of machines and the focus of gym-goers lost in their routines, a clash was brewing. A simple encounter, something as mundane as a workout, was about to spiral into something much bigger. He had been coming to this gym for weeks now, like clockwork. It wasn't the most glamorous place, but it had everything he needed. A quiet corner to lift, a chance to get lost in his own thoughts, and the sound of weights scraping against the floor, his kind of sanctuary. The man was focused, determined, his routine well practiced. But today, something was different. There was a woman, standing just a few feet away. She was a familiar face, someone who often worked out during the same hours as him. At first, it was nothing unusual. He didn't pay much attention to her, after all, people come and go in the gym all the time. But this time, as he moved to adjust the weights, he could feel her eyes on him. Not the typical glance of someone waiting for their turn on the machine. This was something more, something he couldn't quite shake off. She started muttering to herself, her words barely audible over the music blaring from his headphones. At first, he tried to ignore it. It was the gym, after all. Everyone had their own way of handling stress or pushing themselves. But then the words became clearer. It was a subtle jab at him, a comment about his form, about how he looked, about everything he was doing wrong. And it wasn't just an offhand remark. It was pointed, deliberate. At first, he told himself to keep his head down, to focus on his workout, but her words kept cutting through the rhythm of his set. He tried to shake it off. After all, it wasn't worth getting involved in drama over a gym session. But the more he tried to ignore her, the louder and more aggressive she became. "You don't belong here," she said, loud enough for the others nearby to hear. The words hit him like a sudden jolt of cold water. He froze, unsure of how to react. What did she mean by that? He was used to the occasional odd comment in public spaces. People sometimes made assumptions based on what they saw. But this felt different. It wasn't just an offhand comment. This felt like something deeper, something rooted in more than just a casual misunderstanding. The gym, which had once felt like a safe space for him to unwind and improve, suddenly felt alien. His mind raced. Was she trying to start a confrontation? Why now? Why here? Why him? Before he could respond, another comment came, even more cutting than the first. "You don't even belong in here. You think you can just come in and take up space like that?" His chest tightened, and his heart started pounding. The gym suddenly seemed too small, too crowded with the noise of people lifting and the ringing of weights. All of it seemed so far away now. For a moment, he wondered if he should just walk away, let it go, and continue his workout. He knew better than to escalate things. But something inside him refused to be silent. Something deep in his gut told him this wasn't just about him. It was about a much bigger issue. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, time seemed to stand still. The world around him blurred, and it was just the two of them in this moment. Her expression was cold, almost predatory, and he felt a knot form in his stomach. But the moment didn't last. She stepped closer to him, her voice rising now, no longer content to keep the confrontation quiet. "You're just a distraction. People like you don't belong here," she hissed, her words sharp as a blade. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the way she said them, like she genuinely believed it. That's when he realized this wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't about a random disagreement over gym etiquette or a misplaced comment. This was personal. But why? Why had she targeted him, out of everyone in the gym? The tension in the air was palpable. Around them, The gym goers had started to notice the exchange, but no one stepped in. Everyone had their own set of priorities: weights to lift, machines to claim, and routines to follow. But for him, it was no longer just about working out. This moment was about something far more profound. What happened next would leave everyone, including him, questioning their own assumptions about what could happen in a public space, how an innocent trip to the gym could quickly spiral out of control, how one moment could change everything. But before he could decide whether to speak up or walk away, before he could even react, the woman said something that would completely alter the course of the day. Something that no one in the gym could have ever anticipated. And that was just the beginning. What happened next was so shocking, so unexpected, that it would leave everyone involved speechless. The outcome of that encounter was something no one could have predicted. The gym's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he stood there, frozen, caught in the unrelenting heat of the moment. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Why was she targeting him? Why now? He had no history with this woman. He didn't even know her name. For all he knew, she could have been anyone, just another person going through the motions of life, like him. But the venom in her voice, the hostility in her eyes, that was something he couldn't ignore. He'd been through his fair share of awkward interactions, sure, but this felt different. It felt personal, and he wasn't sure why. He glanced around the gym, almost pleading for someone to step in. But no one did. People were either too engrossed in their own workouts or too uncomfortable to intervene in what was unfolding before them. It was like they had all chosen to pretend nothing was happening. The weight of silence pressed in around him, and it felt as though the entire gym had become a stage for a play, everyone watching, but no one willing to act. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, trying to figure out his next move. Should he walk away? Should he keep his head down and just ignore her? But that nagging feeling in his gut told him that doing nothing would be just as bad as giving in to her provocations. The woman stood a few feet away now, her eyes narrow, lips pursed in a thin line. There was a sense of entitlement in the way she carried herself, like she had some sort of power here, like she had the right to call the shots. Her posture was rigid, and her fists were clenched by her sides, the tension in her body practically vibrating through the air. The more he thought about it, the more everything felt wrong. He wasn't just being judged for his appearance or his workout technique. No, this felt deeper. The way she had looked at him earlier, the comments she made, they weren't just about a casual disagreement. It wasn't just about someone telling him he wasn't lifting correctly or criticizing his form. This was something else entirely. It was something far more unsettling. She took a step toward him, her shoes making a soft click against the gym floor, and for a second, he braced himself. The last thing he wanted was for things to escalate, but there was a part of him that felt like he couldn't back down now. Not after everything she'd said. Not after how deeply her words had cut him. "What do you think you're doing here?" she asked, her voice now loud enough for those nearby to hear, the words coming out sharp and deliberate. "You think you can just come in and take up space? You don't belong in a place like this." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He had so many questions. What did she mean by that? Why was she so fixated on him? But he was struck by the absurdity of the whole situation. Here he was, just trying to work out, and yet he was standing in the middle of a confrontation he had never expected. He tried to steady his breathing, to calm himself, but the tension was thick, choking the air between them. The more she spoke, the more he realized something that made his stomach turn. This wasn't just about him being there. This wasn't about a miscommunication or some simple misunderstanding. This was about something much deeper. It was about her own perceptions, her own prejudices. He glanced around once more, hoping for a sign of intervention. But the gym goers continued on as if they were all in their own little worlds, oblivious to the discomfort unfolding right in front of them. It struck him no one was going to help. No one was going to step in. The woman's voice grew louder, more frantic now. You have no idea what you're doing here, do you? You don't belong in this space. People like you never do. The words stung more than he was willing to admit. They weren't just a criticism of him as a person, they felt like a deep, personal attack. Who was she to say such things? Who was she to decide who belonged and who didn't? But the deeper he thought about it, the more it became clear this wasn't really about him at all. It was about something else, something that had nothing to do with the gym or his workout. He felt the weight of her words settle in his chest like a lead balloon. He wasn't just being judged for his physical appearance or his presence in the gym. No, she had made it clear he wasn't welcome in this space. It was a message that ran deeper than just these few moments. This was about the broader, invisible boundaries people set up in society, the lines that decided who was allowed to be in certain spaces and who wasn't. Her gaze didn't waver from his, and her words were calculated, like they had been rehearsed in her mind for a long time. I'm not the only one who feels this way, you know, she said with a smirk, like she had just exposed a hidden truth. There are plenty of people in here who agree with me. They're just too afraid to say anything. His heart began to race, the realization sinking in. Was she trying to rally others against him? Was she trying to make this about something larger, to turn him into the villain in a story she had already written in her mind? The gym, once a place of refuge, now felt like an arena, with her playing the role of the antagonist and him unwillingly cast as the villain. The woman took another step forward, and this time, he couldn't help but take a step back. He wasn't proud of it. But there was something about the way she spoke, the venom in her tone, that made him feel small. He could feel his own uncertainty begin to creep up. Was this really happening? Was this what he was going to be remembered for, this moment of weakness? You think you're tough? She continued, her words becoming more scathing with each passing second. You think you can just come in here and take over? This is my space, and I'm not about to let you mess it up. For a moment, the world seemed to close in around him. He wanted to say something, anything to defend himself, to make it clear that he didn't deserve this treatment. But nothing seemed to come out. Instead, he was frozen, caught in the web of her accusations, unable to break free. Why are you even here? She pressed, her voice now practically a hiss. You don't belong here. People like you don't belong anywhere. Her words were a punch to the gut. It was as though everything that had been building up inside her had finally exploded in that one chilling statement. It wasn't just about the gym anymore. It was about him, about people like him, and the unspoken divide that existed between them. But what made the situation even more surreal was how she kept talking, as if this was a conversation they were having. She wasn't just angry, she was making statements, accusations, assumptions. She was trying to make him believe that he was the problem here, that he was the one who didn't belong. The gym was suddenly too small. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. He needed to get out. But something held him in place. Was it fear? Anger? Or was it something else, something deeper that told him he couldn't just walk away from this? As if sensing his hesitation, the woman stepped even closer, now inches away from him, and whispered, I told you, you don't belong here. Not now, not ever. Her words hung in the air like a threat, heavy and ominous. The gym had become a battleground, and it wasn't just a physical one. It was about power, about control, about the subtle and often invisible lines that society drew. In that moment, it became clear this wasn't about a gym membership or lifting weights. This was a clash of ideologies, a conflict that went far beyond the walls of this small space. He stood there, torn between walking away and standing his ground. Neither option seemed right, and yet both felt inevitable. But before he could make any decision, Something unexpected happened, something that would change everything. He heard a voice from the crowd. A single voice, distant at first, but growing louder. The gym had been silent, but now it wasn't. The voice grew louder, cutting through the tension that had filled the room. It wasn't a voice of authority or command. It wasn't even particularly angry. But it was enough to shift the energy in the gym, enough to stop the woman in her tracks. He turned, barely able to believe what he was hearing. A woman, a stranger to him, had stepped forward, her tone clear, but not confrontational. "She's not the only one who belongs here," the woman said, her eyes fixed on the woman who had been verbally attacking him. "This is a public space. We all share it." The gym goers, who had been quietly observing the altercation, suddenly seemed to notice the tension. A few glanced around, unsure of what to do. Others continued with their workouts, pretending they didn't hear. It was as if the air itself had thickened, and every breath felt like it carried weight. The woman who had been harassing him froze. Her body stiffened as she turned slowly to face the newcomer, the mask of hostility now replaced with something sharper. It wasn't fear, but a flicker of recognition, as though this wasn't the first time she had encountered resistance. "Who do you think you are?" she snapped, her voice cold and biting. "Mind your own business." The newcomer didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture straight, and her eyes steady. "I think it's time someone said something," she replied, not raising her voice but speaking with an intensity that commanded attention. "What you're doing is wrong. You don't get to decide who belongs in here, or anywhere for that matter." The confrontation was suddenly not just between him and the woman who had started the verbal attack, but between two forces, two perspectives. The woman who had been targeted, the one who had stayed silent for so long, finally found her voice. But was it enough? And was it too late? He didn't know where to turn his attention. On one side, he was watching the escalation of the woman's fury. She was enraged, her face flushed with anger. Her words were becoming more venomous, but now they were directed at the stranger, who had dared to challenge her. On the other side, he could feel the weight of the eyes in the gym on them, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for this scene to either explode or fizzle out. The man's mind raced. He couldn't help but wonder, was this what people felt like when they were caught in the middle of something much larger than themselves? This wasn't just a random argument. This wasn't about someone criticizing his form. This wasn't about a workout session gone wrong. No, this was a battle of ideologies, a clash of what was acceptable and what was not, a struggle for power. The woman, who had been the first to speak up, wasn't done yet. She wasn't backing down. Her voice was calm, but her words were cutting, and each one landed like a punch. "You don't get to dictate who has a place in this world," she said, her eyes hard as steel. "We all have the right to take up space. We all have the right to exist without being belittled." For a brief moment, the gym seemed to hold its breath. The silence was deafening. People shuffled in place, avoiding eye contact, pretending to focus on their machines, their weights, but none of them could look away. Not now. The woman who had been the aggressor took a deep breath. The rage still lingered in her eyes, but there was a shift in her posture. She was no longer talking to him. She was no longer confronting him. Now, the fight was between her and the woman who had challenged her. She was on the defensive, trying to regroup, trying to find a way to regain control over the situation. Her voice was still filled with venom, but it lacked the strength it once had. "You're just another person who thinks they know better, aren't you? Just another person who thinks they can come in here and fix everything." But the woman who had stepped up wasn't finished. "It's not about fixing everything," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's about doing what's right. What you're doing, what you've been doing, isn't right. You can't treat people like they don't matter." The tension in the room was now unbearable. It was no longer just a confrontation about space or who belonged in the gym. It had become something bigger, something that could no longer be ignored. It was a challenge to a system of exclusion, an unwillingness to accept the way things had always been. The words exchanged in the gym now felt like they were echoing far beyond the walls of the building. It was no longer about one man being harassed. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, overlooked, or unwelcome. As the exchange continued, more voices began to speak out. A man, who had been quietly working out on a treadmill nearby, stepped forward. "She's right," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "We're all here for the same reason, to improve ourselves. No one has the right to make anyone feel like they don't belong." Another voice, a woman from the weights section, chimed in. "It's not just about this gym. It's about everywhere. This kind of thing happens all the time. People are made to feel like they don't have a place, like they don't matter." The harassing woman looked around, her eyes darting nervously from person to person. It was as if, for the first time, she was realizing that she wasn't alone in this space. It wasn't just her world, her rules. There were other voices now, rising against her, challenging the very foundation of what she thought was her right. But instead of backing down, she dug her heels in deeper. "I'm not the problem here," she snapped, her voice rising again. "You're all the ones who are making this out to be something bigger than it is. It's just a gym. I'm just speaking my mind." Her words were frantic now, unraveling as the spotlight shifted away from her. The eyes of the gym were no longer on him. They were on her. But her anger was no less potent. She seemed to be struggling to regain control, trying to pull the situation back into her grasp. But it was too late. The gym had become a microcosm of a much larger issue, a reflection of the world beyond these walls. And no matter how hard she tried to regain control, she couldn't stop the floodgates from opening. The words of the people around her were powerful. They were steady. And they were growing louder. And still, the tension simmered. No one had backed down. No one had surrendered. Everyone was still holding their ground, waiting for the moment when everything would shift. When the balance would finally tip. But for now, it was as if time had slowed to a crawl. The room was full of voices, full of eyes, but nothing was moving forward. The storm was still brewing, and no one knew how it would end. The gym was now filled with a charged silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Every person there felt like they were on the edge of something. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It had become a battle of wills, and everyone could feel the tension crackling in the air. The woman, who had started it all, was still standing tall, her fists clenched, her face flushed with anger. But it was clear that the force she had once brought to her words had begun to falter. The challenge from the others had thrown her off balance. She glared at the growing number of people now speaking out, her eyes darting from one face to another, her lips trembling with the effort to hold on to her control. But the truth was that she was losing it. One by one, voices rose in opposition to her, quiet at first, then more confident, more resolute. People who had been minding their own business just moments ago were now standing up, speaking out, sharing their own frustrations with the way she had treated him. Their words hung heavy in the air, but she didn't want to hear them. "You don't know what it's like," she hissed, shaking her head. "You're all just following along, too scared to think for yourselves. You think I'm problem here? You all just don't get it." The words felt hollow now, like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. The gym had turned into a kind of battleground, but it was no longer just her versus him. It was her against everyone who had ever felt marginalized, ignored, or unwelcome. She looked directly at him again, but this time, there was no smugness in her gaze. There was only frustration, desperation. "You," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "you don't even belong in here. This is my space. I've been coming here for years, and I've never had anyone like you come in and mess it up. It was the same thing she had been saying all along, but now it sounded different. Her voice was no longer as sure, no longer as commanding. She was starting to unravel. Her mask of superiority, the one she had held onto for so long, was slipping away, piece by piece. He could feel it, the shift in the room, the collective energy of the gym goers. For the first time, they were all aligned. They weren't just observing anymore. They were part of this. They had all been silently holding on to their own experiences, their own grievances, waiting for a spark, and now they were speaking out. It was like something had broken free. The silence that had hung over the gym for so long was now filled with voices demanding respect, equality, and the right to exist in this shared space. The woman recoiled as if she hadn't expected this kind of resistance. The tension in the room was suffocating. Everyone held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Would she back down? Would she escalate the conflict further? There was no telling what she would do next. Her eyes darted around the gym again, trying to gauge who was with her, who would stand up for her. But the more she looked, the more she realized that she was alone in this. The gym goers, the very people she had tried to dismiss, had now become a united front. She glanced back at him, her lips curling into a snarl. You think you've won? She spat, her voice growing louder with each word. You think this makes a difference? You think you're the hero in this little story? His heart was pounding now. He wanted to respond, to say something that would put an end to it, but the words didn't come. Instead, he felt the weight of the moment, of all the years of being judged, of being made to feel like an outsider, like he didn't belong. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever felt the sting of exclusion, the pressure of being made to feel less than. It was about every person who had ever been forced to shrink back and accept being treated as if they didn't matter. The gym had stopped being just a building. It had transformed into a symbol of something much larger, a place where people had long been told they didn't belong, and now, they were finally standing up. He could see the faces of those around him, their expressions now filled with determination. This was no longer just a personal battle. This was a movement. But the woman, as much as she had been pushed back, wasn't done. She wasn't ready to admit defeat. The words that spilled from her mouth now were frantic, almost manic. This isn't over, she warned, her voice trembling with anger. You'll regret this. You'll regret messing with me. Her threats were empty, but still, they had a bite to them. The way she said them, with such venom, made the room feel even more tense, as if something was about to break, something that no one could predict. Would the situation escalate even further? Would she act out in a way no one could foresee? The silence after her words was suffocating. It felt like everything was frozen in place. The gym goers were waiting for the next move, waiting for the moment when everything would either calm down or explode. No one knew what was coming next. The outcome was still unknown, and the suspense of it was hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. It was the kind of silence that felt like it would swallow you whole, like the very air in the room had thickened with anticipation. Every muscle in his body was tensed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, without warning, a sound broke through the unmistakable clang of a dumbbell hitting the floor. The noise was sharp, sudden, and it shattered the tension. Everyone turned, their eyes wide, some startled, others unsure of what had just happened. A man from across the room had dropped his weights, his face red with frustration. Enough! He shouted, his voice rising above the growing murmur in the room. This is ridiculous. We're all just trying to get through our workouts. Why don't we all just move on? Let it go, and let's stop making this about anything other than what it is. The words hung in the air, both a plea for peace and a final straw that seemed to snap the already brittle tension. But the question remained, Would it be enough to defuse the situation? Or was the moment of truth still to come? The woman turned toward the man, her eyes narrowing, and for a split second, it seemed like the storm was about to hit. Would she lash out at him next? Would she try to tear down anyone who stood in her way? The gym held its collective breath. What would happen next? Would this simmering tension finally explode, or would it all fizzle out, leaving the room in uneasy silence? Only time would tell, but whatever happened, no one could deny that the outcome of this encounter would change everything for those involved. The tension in the gym was still thick, the silence oppressive, when something unexpected happened. Just as the man's frustrated outburst hung in the air, a voice broke through again. This time, it wasn't from anyone in the crowd, but from the one person no one had expected to hear from. The woman who had been the target of the harassment, the one who had been silently standing by for so long, took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her feet moved like they were weighed down by something heavier than just the gym floor beneath them. Everyone's attention snapped to her as she raised her hand, not in defense, but in a way that felt almost strategic. "I'm done staying silent," she said, her voice carrying a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had filled the room. The words hit harder than any of the accusations had. The gym goers watched her, puzzled. No one had expected this. No one had anticipated that after everything, after the tension that had built up, she would be the one to change the course of what seemed like an inevitable crash. The woman who had harassed him was still shaking with rage, her fists clenched, but she was starting to look less like the aggressor now and more like someone on the verge of losing control. The woman who had remained silent for so long cleared her throat, as if collecting the strength to speak her truth. "You think this is just about a gym," she said, her eyes steady but piercing, "but it's not. This is about more than just a place where we work out. This is about respect. It's about the right to take up space. To exist without being treated like you don't matter." The room felt like it was spinning, and yet everything seemed to come into sharper focus. Her words weren't just a defense, they were a revelation. The man who had been targeted didn't know how to react. Was this going to change everything? Was this going to escalate the situation even more? The woman who had been attacking him flinched, visibly taken aback. "You're just like the rest of them, aren't you?" she snapped, but there was less venom in her voice now. The bite of her words was starting to fade. "Just another person who thinks they know what's best for everyone." The room grew quieter. People were hanging on every word, anticipating what would happen next. Was she about to back down? Was she going to drop her facade and admit defeat, or would she double down on her actions? Before anyone could make a move, the unexpected happened. From the back of the gym, another figure emerged, stepping into the circle that had formed around the confrontation. It was a man, tall, imposing, but with a quiet presence that somehow made him even more noticeable. The gym goers recognized him immediately. He was one of the regular trainers, a familiar face to most. But what happened next stunned everyone. He walked straight up to the woman who had been causing the conflict, his eyes cold and unwavering. "I've seen you in here before," he said, his voice low but firm. "And this is not how we behave in this gym. Not anymore." The woman turned, startled by his approach, but she didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her chest heaving with the remnants of her anger. His words were not just a reprimand, they felt like a final line in the sand. The trainer wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for the whole gym. "You don't get to make others feel small, to make them feel like they don't belong," he continued, his voice rising slightly as the weight of his words sank in. "And it's time someone made that clear. Not just to you, but to everyone who thinks it's okay to treat others like this." The gym was now completely still. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Everyone was waiting for the next moment, for the next shocking revelation. Would she fight back? Would she accept what was being said to her? Would this be the moment that turned the tide? The woman who had been harassing him seemed lost for words, the snarl on her face replaced by an almost defeated look. She shook her head slowly, as if trying to process what was happening, but the truth was clear. She was losing control. The attention was no longer on her. The gym wasn't afraid anymore. It wasn't just a few voices speaking out, it was the whole space, standing against her. But just when it seemed like the confrontation was about to hit its peak, something even more unexpected occurred. Another gym goer, someone who had been quiet up until now, standing near the cardio section, stepped forward, holding their phone out. They had been recording the entire encounter. The moment was now being captured, every word, every action, every shift in the atmosphere, preserved in real time. It was no longer just a private incident. The entire gym was part of the story. The eyes of everyone in the room, even the ones who had remained silent until now, were now on the woman. The realization hit like a bolt of lightning. What had started as a personal confrontation was now becoming something far more significant. The woman who had been harassing him looked from the phone to the people around her, her face contorting in disbelief. She opened her mouth, trying to protest, but no words came out. She looked at the trainer, who stood unwavering, and then back at the people who had spoken up, the ones who had taken a stand, even in small ways. It was as if the weight of the moment was crashing down on her all at once. And then, in a move that no one saw coming, the woman turned and began to walk away, quickly, her body stiff with anger but no longer standing her ground. She didn't say another word. She didn't try to argue further. She simply left, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet gym. But even as she walked away, the tension didn't fully lift. Everyone knew that this wasn't just the end of an argument. It was a moment that had rippled far beyond the gym's walls. The conversation about who belonged and who didn't, about who had the right to take up space, was only just beginning. The gym may have been quiet for now, but the air was still thick with something unspoken, something that had yet to fully unfold. And as the gym goers began to return to their routines, their thoughts, their personal spaces, the question lingered: what would happen next? Would things go back to normal, or had the seed been planted for a larger change, one that no one could predict? No one knew yet. But one thing was for sure: this encounter had changed everything. The quiet moments in the gym would never be the same again. And the truth, the uncomfortable truth that had been uncovered, would echo far longer than anyone expected. The gym was quiet now, a heavy stillness hanging in the air as the woman who had caused the chaos stormed out. People exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. It felt as though the tension had evaporated, leaving behind a fragile peace. But even as the room returned to its usual rhythm, it was clear that the moment wasn't really over. It was more of a pause, a breath before something else would happen. The trainer, still standing firmly in the center of the gym, turned to the others who had witnessed the entire ordeal. "We're all here to work on ourselves," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Whether that's lifting weights, improving our health, or supporting each other. We won't let anyone tear that down." His words were like a rallying cry, reminding everyone in the room why they came there in the first place. The air in the gym, once thick with uncertainty, began to clear, and people slowly returned to their workouts. But then, just as everyone seemed to settle back into their routines, a sound echoed through the gym, a loud, sharp ping of a phone notification. The trainer's head turned toward the source, a subtle shift in his expression. It was his phone, vibrating with an incoming message. A message that would change everything. He glanced at the screen, his fingers pausing for a moment as he read the text. The smile that had been lingering on his face vanished, replaced by a deep frown. The gym goers, who had been moving back to their exercises, stopped once again, sensing something had shifted. The trainer's eyes met the screen, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" someone asked, their voice trembling with uncertainty. The trainer didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, staring at the message. After a few long seconds, he slowly looked up at the group, his expression grave. "I wasn't going to share this," he began, his voice lower than usual. "But it looks like now's the time." He paused again, as if collecting his thoughts. "The woman who just left. She's not who she seemed to be." The room went completely still. Every single person in the gym was hanging on his words, waiting for the revelation that seemed inevitable. "She's not just a regular gym goer," the trainer continued, his eyes scanning the room. "She works for the gym's upper management. And she's been part of a larger issue that's been brewing for months. This whole situation, it wasn't just a personal confrontation. It was orchestrated." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the shock settled in. The woman's behavior, her sense of entitlement, it all suddenly made sense in a way no one had anticipated. This wasn't just one woman with an unchecked attitude. This was someone who had been using her position to create division, to sow discord, and to push an agenda that none of them had seen coming. The gym goers who had rallied together in the face of her aggression now realized that they had been manipulated. They weren't just standing up for one person, they were standing up against a system that had been quietly exploiting people, dividing them, making them feel less than. "I didn't want to believe it," the trainer said, his voice thick with frustration. "But it's true. And now we're all a part of it. We've been part of a much larger problem than we realized." For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of this new information settled over them like a cloud. They weren't just fighting for fairness anymore, they were fighting for something much bigger. This wasn't just about one woman's rude behavior. It was about corruption, manipulation, and the system that had allowed it to thrive. But just as the reality of the situation hit them, the gym doors suddenly burst open with a force that made everyone jump. Standing in the doorway was a man in a suit, someone no one recognized. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto the trainer. Without missing a beat, the man strode forward, pulling out a card. "I'm from the corporate office," the man said, his voice cold. "And I think you all need to understand something important." The trainer frowned, his posture stiffening. "What's going on here?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he walked up to the front desk, where another gym goer was waiting. "You're all being watched," the man said, his eyes sharp. "Everything that happened here today, everything you think you've witnessed, it's been part of a much larger investigation." The room was now filled with confusion and unease. Everyone had been caught in a web they didn't even know existed. The trainer, who had been trying to protect the gym's integrity, now realized that he, too, was caught in this game of manipulation. The gym goers, each person who had stood up, who had taken part in the collective push for justice, were all being watched. What was going to happen next? The man in the suit spoke again, but this time, his tone carried something far more ominous. "You think you've won? You've only just begun to uncover the truth. And trust me when I say, the consequences are far from over." As the man turned and walked out of the gym, leaving everyone in stunned silence, a chill swept through the air. The trainer's eyes met the crowd's, and he could see the fear in their faces. This wasn't the resolution they had been expecting. The conflict had escalated, but now, they were all part of something much larger, something that reached beyond the gym, beyond their individual experiences. The gym goers exchanged uneasy looks, unsure of what to do next. The battle they had just fought was only the tip of the iceberg. There were still forces at play, still unknowns that had yet to be revealed. And then, as if on cue, a message pinged on the trainer's phone again. This time, it wasn't just any message, it was an anonymous email, and the subject line was chilling: "The truth you've been looking for is much closer than you think." The story was far from over. The gym goers, the trainer, and even the woman who had sparked it all were now players in a much larger game, one where the stakes were higher than any of them could have imagined. The real battle was just beginning. And no one knew who would come out on top. The gym was eerily quiet after the man in the suit left. The unsettling words he had left hanging in the air seemed to echo in everyone's mind. The trainer stood there, holding his phone, staring at the screen, as the gym-goers looked at each other, unsure of what to say next. The entire dynamic had shifted. They had thought they were standing up to one person, one woman whose actions were wrong and unfair. But now it was clear that something much larger, something more complicated, was at play. No one knew who the man in the suit was. No one knew what the investigation was about or how deep it went. But one thing was for sure: they weren't going to let fear paralyze them. They had fought for respect, for fairness, and they weren't about to stop now, even if the stakes had been raised higher than they'd ever imagined. The trainer took a deep breath and looked up at the group of people who had gathered around him. He could feel the weight of their uncertainty. The tension was still palpable, but he knew they needed answers, and he needed to provide some sense of clarity. "I know this is a lot," the trainer said, breaking the silence. "But we can't let this stop us. What happened today wasn't just about what one person did. It's about something bigger, about all of us, how we treat each other, and how we hold ourselves accountable. The woman who started all this, she's not the only one at fault. We've all seen things, we've all felt things, and we need to figure out where we stand." He paused, glancing at the group, letting his words settle in. "We can't let fear of what's happening behind the scenes stop us from doing what's right." The group nodded slowly, some still uncertain, others more resolute. The trainer continued, his voice steady. "We're not going to let this go. Whatever is going on, whoever is behind this, we will find out. But we have to stick together. We have to support each other. We've already started something here today. And we won't stop until we get answers." That was all anyone needed to hear. The group, now more unified than ever, rallied together. They may not have had all the answers yet, but they knew they couldn't back down. What started as a conflict in the gym had now become a battle for something larger than any of them could have expected. The stakes were high, but so were their resolve and their desire for justice. Over the next few weeks, the gym-goers continued with their workouts, but the undercurrent of tension never fully disappeared. There were whispers, side glances, and a sense that everyone was waiting for the next move. The trainer took the lead, staying in close contact with some of the regulars who had witnessed everything. They worked together, gathering information, sharing stories, and keeping an eye out for anything that might point to the truth. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. They learned that the woman who had instigated the conflict was not just an employee of the gym, but someone with ties to the gym's corporate leadership. She had been using her position to manipulate situations, creating division and conflict to keep people in line and maintain control. She had been part of a larger effort to push certain members out, people who had been vocal in their desire for a more inclusive, supportive gym environment. And it wasn't just about the gym, it was part of a larger corporate agenda that aimed to maximize profits by maintaining an atmosphere of competition and division. The gym-goers were shocked, but they also felt a growing sense of determination. They had always known that something wasn't right, but now they had the proof. They had uncovered the web of manipulation and deceit that had been at play for so long. As they gathered more evidence, they knew they had to take action. But the question was how. The trainer, who had been their voice of reason, now found himself at the center of the storm. It wasn't just about standing up for one person anymore, it was about standing up for the entire gym community, for everyone who had been silenced, pushed aside, or made to feel like they didn't belong. The group made a plan. They would confront the corporate leadership, expose the woman's actions, and bring the truth to light. It was risky, and there was no guarantee that they would be heard, but they couldn't stay silent anymore. They had come too far, and the truth was too important to ignore. On the day of the confrontation, the trainer gathered the group in the gym one last time before heading to the corporate office. It was early in the morning, and the gym was still quiet, the early morning members lost in their routines. But the trainer could feel the weight of the moment. "This is it," he said, standing in front of the group, his voice firm. "We've got the truth. Now we just need to make sure it's heard. Whatever happens next, know that we did the right thing. We fought for what was right. We stood up for each other. And we didn't let fear stop us." With that, they all headed out, determined to expose what had been hidden for so long. At the corporate office, they were met with resistance at first. The higher-ups tried to dismiss their claims, brushing them aside as disgruntled gym-goers with an agenda. But the group was prepared. They had the evidence, the recordings, and the testimonials to back up everything they had uncovered. And when the woman who had caused the conflict was brought in, the look on her face said it all. She hadn't expected this kind of retaliation. She had thought she could continue controlling things behind the scenes, but now she was faced with the truth of her actions. The confrontation was intense, but in the end, the truth prevailed. The woman was removed from her position, and the corporate leadership was forced to take accountability for the toxic culture that had been cultivated within the gym. Changes were made, new leadership was brought in, and the gym began to move toward a more inclusive, supportive environment for everyone. For the gym goers, it was a hard-won victory. But it was a victory nonetheless. They had fought for something larger than themselves. They had exposed the truth, and in doing so, had changed the course of the gym's future. The trainer returned to the gym with a sense of peace. The gym had been through so much, but now it felt different. There was a new energy in the air, one of unity, respect, and understanding. No longer was it just a place to work out, it was a space where people truly belong. As for the group that had fought for what was right, they knew they had made a difference. They had stood up, not just for themselves, but for each other. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. The gym was a place where anyone could walk in and feel safe, valued, and respected. The story had come full circle, and the gym goers were left with a powerful reflection: standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult or dangerous, is always worth it. The fight for respect, for fairness, for equality is something that doesn't end. And while their battle may have concluded, the fight for a better, more just world would continue. And with that, they all left the gym that day knowing one thing for sure: they had been a part of something bigger than themselves. Something that had started as an isolated confrontation had turned into a movement for change. And as long as people stood together, nothing could stop